across Yellowstone National Park, people are disappearing or disappearing and then turning up dead. And the most disturbing part is that this has been going on for years. Yellowstone is one of the most dangerous national parks that we have, and in August of 2022, a park employee learned this reality the hard way. On August 16th, 2022, a park employee was notified that something strange was floating in the 181-degree Fahrenheit water of the Abyss Pool hot spring. At first, it looked like someone had carelessly dropped some trash into the water, but when the employee crouched down to get a closer look, he could see that it was clearly shaped like a shoe. And that immediately raised a red flag because one of his coworkers had actually found some pieces of a hiking shoe floating in that very same pool just 1 week earlier. And so maybe this new floating object was part of that same mysterious pair of shoes. Either way, the park employee was determined to fish this object out of the water, and so he grabbed a tool and was able to reach out from the boardwalk, scoop it up, and then dump it out on land. After he did this, he realized that his original guess had basically been spot on. He had pulled out yet another shoe from the Abyss Pool, but there was something very off about this particular shoe. Oh, and something else that's very off is that more than 50% of my viewers are not subscribed to the channel. And so if you've watched a few of my videos now and you want to help us reach our goal of hitting 1 million subscribers this year, please hit that button. I have the best subscribers on YouTube and I'd love for you to join. So when the park employee finally picked up this weird shoe, it felt heavier than he'd expected, right? And so he cautiously looked inside, and you'll never guess what he found. You probably do actually know what he found inside the shoe. I'm sure the park employee actually knew as well. Turns out it was a human foot, which that's pretty much the last thing anyone would ever want to find in a national park. But before we figure out exactly how this whole nightmare started, I think we have to back up to just a few weeks earlier on the morning of July 31st, and we need to meet a 70-year-old Korean man from Los Angeles named Ilhan Rowe. Ilhan was on a solo trip to Yosemite and had just stayed the night at a place called the Canyon Lodge and Cabins. The lodge is located deep inside the park, and it's surrounded by miles of forest and the steaming geothermal basins that have helped make Yellowstone such a famous and dangerous tourist attraction. Ilhan had just stayed one night, and as he checked out that morning, he packed his belongings into his gray Kia SUV, and he drove away, heading south through the park's winding roads. Nearly an hour later, he pulled into the parking area near the steaming pools of the West Thumb Geyser Basin. The basin is one of the many spots throughout the park where boiling springs and geysers sit just feet away from these old wooden boardwalks that visitors can, use to walk out on and explore these gorgeous pools. Now, I've never been to Yellowstone, but I've seen a lot of photos. I'm sure you have too, and it looks incredible and super beautiful, colorful. And I've also read that these hot springs themselves legitimately stink. If you've been there, let me know if this is the case in the comments. I know there's a scientific explanation for why they smell so bad, but I still don't tend to go on vacation to places that smell so much like rotten eggs. So that'll be a first for me when I do eventually make it out there. But regardless of the smell or the danger, Ilhan stepped out of his car at West Thumb Geyser Basin, ventured out into the area, and that's when things in this story started to get extremely fuzzy. And I say that because no one reported seeing him on the trails that day. No one remembers passing him on the boardwalks, and his car just kind of sat there abandoned in the parking lot. Ilhan Rowe had silently vanished into Yellowstone National Park. Information on this story was very hard to find, but as far as I can tell, no one actually notified the police that he was missing. His family didn't call wondering where he was, and I guess no one thought it was weird that his car was just sitting in the same parking spot for a long time. This is very unusual because in so many of these mysteries, the authorities are notified quickly, they jump right into action, they start chasing down theories. But in this case, no one was searching for Ilhan for days and days. Over 2 weeks later, on August 16th, a park tour driver pulled over near the basin after a visitor kind of waved him down, begging him to stop. The visitor was clearly very upset, and he asked the driver to look at something strange he had found floating in one of the steaming pools. The driver, the visitor, and then a few park rangers started to gather at the edge of the Abyss Pool, which is a deep, glassy hot spring that simmers around 181 degrees Fahrenheit again. And At first, they thought that this mysterious object could have just been like some debris. It was dark and drifting slowly through the bright blue water, but as they carefully fished it out, the shape became clearer, and they knew this wasn't just some random trash or driftwood. And that's when they realized that it was a human foot. And to make things even crazier, the foot was still inside of a black hiking shoe. Size 8.5 in case you were curious. The shoe was still laced up tight, but the rest of the body was nowhere to be found. And so authorities were left scratching their heads. I mean, what the hell could have possibly happened here? Why did they only find a foot? And so they started to wonder if maybe it was foul play. I mean, maybe the foot, this is gross, but you good? Okay. Maybe the foot was like cut off and then dumped into the hot spring. I don't know. I mean, that seems unlikely since the park is extremely popular and not really like an ideal secret dumping spot. An animal attack was another possibility, but the remains showed no clear bite marks and no visitors had reported aggressive bears or animals in the area. And so the other chilling and very painful theory would be that the foot was actually boiled off by the extremely hot water. Ugh. Now, if that is in fact what happened, I mean, that would have to be one of the most gruesome stories that I've ever read. I don't even want to think about it anymore. Authorities searched the rest of the Abyss pool carefully using unmanned aerial drones with cameras, specialized tools to fish for debris from the boardwalks, and even sonar technology to scan the bottom, right? They did all of this, but they could not find any other remains. However, they were able to find something else that somehow might be even more upsetting than finding a foot. Throughout the search, investigators reported finding what they described as, this is even grosser. They described them as fatty deposits on the surface of the water, which they believed could be evidence that more human tissue had been boiled and broken down over time within the hot spring. I'm not trying to gross you out. I just don't know how else to tell this story. And so, despite mostly coming up empty on the rest of their search, they used the existing evidence and DNA analysis to answer the question that everyone was wondering about, which was, whose foot did they find in the Abyss pool? After all that searching and diligent testing, authorities were able to identify that the foot belonged to none other than Ilhan Rowe. But the biggest mystery still wasn't solved. They were able to connect with one of his relatives to reconfirm the DNA results, but they still had no idea how a 70-year-old man ended up in a boiling hot spring in the first place with no witnesses. And so that's when park rangers started paying attention to the nearby parking lot. They noticed that the gray Kia SUV parked at West Thumb Geyser Basin looked like it hadn't been moved in weeks. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a laptop on the seat, a folded park map, and some personal photographs. They also discovered a wallet with $447 in cash, and there was also a small notebook with pages and pages of handwritten poems, but these poems were written in Korean. You know where I'm going with this. When they ran the license plate, they figured out that the car was registered to Ilhan, and they went on to translate the poems, searching for some kind of clue that might explain why they found his foot in the hot spring. They wondered if maybe he was trying to take his own life, and he left behind these poems and notes for people to find eventually, but after they translated them, the poems didn't indicate anything like that. And nothing else in the car made his trail between the vehicle and the basin any clearer. Officials also looked around the car and the parking lot to see if they could find any evidence of foul play. They searched for additional DNA, footprints, fingerprints, they searched for all this stuff, but they couldn't find anything else. And so they concluded that there was no evidence that anyone hurt Ilhan, and to this day, they still have no real explanation for how he ended up disappearing into the hottest hot springs on planet Earth, basically. The Abyss pool continues to be a popular tourist attraction with tons of visitors crowding the boardwalks above it. They're there to admire the impossible blue beauty of it all, but they rarely consider the horrors that are literally right beneath their feet. My heart hurts for Ilhan Rowe, his family, his friends, and please show him some love in the comments. Again, I haven't been to Yellowstone, but just based on what I found in this story, it feels most likely that he fell into them by accident, but We really don't know. Yellowstone's hot springs can be dangerous if you're not careful, but the mountains can be deadly no matter what you do. And on September 17th, 2024, a 22-year-old park employee named Austin King was standing at the highest point in the entire park. He reached for his phone to call the people that he loved the most. This was a very special moment for him, but no one picked up. So he ended up leaving a voicemail, and no one knew that this weird voicemail would be the last time that anyone ever heard Austin King's voice. Now, I thought that Ilhan Rowe's story was strange, but when I heard Austin's story, that's when it truly set in that something is just not right in Yellowstone. I think you're gonna understand what I mean. I love our national parks, but I also believe that people need to be informed about what's going on inside of them. And frankly, it wouldn't be possible for me to tell these stories without our sponsors and without coffee. Look, I've made enough questionable decisions in my life. My coffee doesn't need to be one of them. And that's why I've been using Trade Coffee, the sponsor of this video. You take a quick quiz online and then their expert baristas, tasters, and Q graders match you with coffees that you'll actually like, which is great because if I was choosing purely on bag art, then, well, I would be in serious trouble. Trade is the #1 coffee destination in the US, and they've spent over a decade building relationships with more than 55 top roasters across the country, and so you are going to get access to coffees that you would have never found on your own. They curate over 500 coffees. Every bag is roasted to order and then shipped fresh to your door, and so you are truly getting the highest quality coffee without paying like a huge premium price, by the way. The coffee that I got from Trade was so good, like seriously the best coffee I've ever had. Colonnade from Small Plains was one of them. It's like rich and chocolatey. Flatlander from PT's was super smooth with like a caramel and a little bit of citrus taste. Oh, and even if I did choose this one based on bag art, it would have been a good move because I mean, this is just like so slick. And Badtown Blend from Timeless was just like a really solid everyday cup. Oh, and I almost forgot, if your first bag isn't right for whatever reason, which I don't think is gonna happen, but if that's the case, Trade will replace it for free with their first bag guarantee. Right now, Trade is offering up to 40% off your first order. Wow, 40% off at drinktrade.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinktrade.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link at the top of the description. You are going to get the best coffee that you've ever had in your life. I can guarantee it. And so click that link. And now let's get into one of the most baffling stories in national park history. During the summer of 2024, Austin King had been working as a concessions employee inside Yellowstone, and he spent his free days hiking all over the park and just hanging out with his fellow young employees. I mean, this sounds pretty much like a dream job, but as the season was beginning to wind down, Austin still had one more big goal for himself. He was going to summit Eagle Peak. At 11,361 feet above sea level, the summit seemed like a picture-perfect way to end his incredible summer, and it had been something that he was actually planning for a long time. This wasn't some kind of spontaneous stunt. He was ready to reach the top of this peak, or at least he thought he was. Austin started his journey by arranging a boat ride across Yellowstone Lake. And this is a very common thing for hikers planning to climb Eagle Peak to do. They take a boat to Bridge Bay Marina and then hop on the trail from there. Austin planned to summit the mountain and then make his way back down to the marina later that day for the boat ride back. Things were going according to plan so far, but that was all about to change once he finally set foot on the trail. As Austin started to climb, a thick layer of fog prevented him from even being able to like see the top of the mountain, right? And so he quickly realized that this late September hike was not going to feel like the sweet summer weather he had been enjoying for the last few months. He endured rain, sleet, hail, and some of the most brutal wind that anyone could ever expect to face. But despite the terrible conditions, he kept climbing. I mean, this was his final like hoorah after all. As he got higher and higher up the mountain, the weather just kept getting worse, eventually even pushing him off course. It actually pushed him so far off course that it basically forced him to like free solo multiple cliffs that he wasn't originally planning on having to navigate. You know, he's trying to find his way back to trail, which is just crazy. And imagine doing this in like wet, windy conditions too, like just so dangerous. But despite this unplanned detour, we'll call it, Austin never gave up. He kept pushing forward until eventually he reached the summit of Eagle Peak. He had finally done it. And in his mind, this trip was a huge success, despite the challenges that he had faced along the way. As Austin sat there on top of the mountain, looking out into the distance, he decided that it was now time to celebrate a little bit. He pulled out a pen and paper and then wrote a letter to his family about everything he had went through on his way to the summit. He wrote about the tough weather. He wrote about getting pushed up the wrong path. He wrote, quote, "I truly cannot believe I am here after what it took to be here." This letter clearly showed that he was a little bit exhausted, probably a lot of bits, but he also celebrated the beauty of the whole adventure. He went on to write, quote, "I will never forget this day for the rest of my life. Life is beautiful. Go out and live it." Austin even added this little smiley face to the bottom of the letter. He was tired, surely, but as far as he was concerned, he was basically on top of the world. After he wrote his letter, Austin decided to reach for his phone and give his dad a call, eager to describe the exhilaration of standing on the tallest peak in the same park he had spent his summer working in. However, this phone call didn't end up connecting, and so he was able to leave a voicemail. And that's where he expressed pretty much the same excitement that he expressed in the letter. However, this voicemail was also a bit concerning because it sounded like Austin was feeling a little bit scared. He talked about the thick fog that was rolling in and about a snowstorm that looked like it was about to hit during his descent. His dad didn't immediately get this voicemail, but Austin knew that he needed to get off this mountain as soon as possible. And so somewhere between that fateful phone call attempt and Austin's scheduled boat ride back to the main park, something went wrong. Austin failed to show up at the marina, and the employees there were pretty much immediately concerned. They feared that he was obviously stranded somewhere on the stormy mountain. Search efforts would begin the next day, and I'm honestly not sure why it took them so long to start. Maybe because of the winter conditions, maybe it was just too dangerous to search in the dark. I don't know, but regardless, with Yellowstone personnel and volunteers pushing into the backcountry in this urgent attempt to retrace Austin's route, they began searching drainages, ridgelines, and heavily forested areas. They were calling out his name, scanning for any sign that he had maybe taken shelter from the snow or had been injured up on one of the many technical cliffs. But then the weather just got worse and worse. More blizzards swept across the mountain, layering snow over the hiking trails and obscuring any tracks that might have led them to Austin. The worsening conditions eventually forced the search teams to basically halt their efforts until the weather cleared. And during this pause, Austin's family and park authorities were forced to just think over every possible theory about what could have happened to him. Obviously, the weather was a huge factor in all of this, and the likelihood that Austin suffered from exposure was extremely high. And officials also had to consider that the snow and ice could have caused him to fall, which could have happened while he was climbing a rocky cliff or simply walking down even a non-technical trail. They knew that he had made it to the top of Eagle Peak because they had his voicemail as proof, but they had no clue where he could have ended up after that. They were basically at a total loss, but before winter fully sealed off the area, searchers did manage to uncover one of the most important clues in this entire case. Crews were starting to get pretty desperate, but a smaller group was combing through the upper Howell Creek area when one of the volunteers noticed something strange that stood out in the white snow. The object was right off the side of the trail, and so they stepped over to investigate it. I mean, was this the big break that they'd all been hoping to find, right? After taking a few steps through the thick snow, they realized that they had somehow stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. They dug through the gear, and that's when one of the crew members opened up a backpack and pulled out something that made it clear that this gear had indeed belonged to Austin King. They found the letter that he had written at the top of Eagle Peak. The campsite, as well as the letter itself, helped crews confirm that Austin had traveled through that particular section of the backcountry, but there was no other sign of him anywhere else. The snow had long since covered any tracks he might have made, and there was nothing else in his gear that explained where he had gone or what had happened to him. And so the discovery of the campsite seemed like a super promising clue, but ultimately it only deepened the mystery. As months passed and a full Yellowstone winter settled over the landscape, the nature of the search for Austin began to change. Officials weren't able to find any additional clues after the campsite, which forced them to acknowledge the harsh reality that they were no longer running a true rescue operation. Given the extreme conditions of Yellowstone National Park, the likelihood that Austin survived the winter was basically zero, And so The focus was now fully on recovering his body and bringing some closure to his family. But just as they began the tough process of accepting that truth, officials talked to one of Austin's coworkers from the park and uncovered information that could have changed everything. This coworker told them that Austin had prepared for every possible outcome on the mountain and that he mentioned an alternate descent route, just in case he had to bail out for any reason, right? And that potential alternate route would have led towards the U.S. Forest Service trailhead at Eagle Creek Campground, an area with partial glacial sections and very dense forest. This fresh lead gave search crews an entirely new area to comb through, and in August of 2025, a 20-person private search team returned to the mountain with the hope that they could finally close out this Yellowstone mystery. They searched the alternate route with helicopters, drones, and volunteer ground crews that even included Austin's father, by the way. But in the end, that search came up empty too. To this day, Austin King is still missing, and his family is left with that one final voicemail and the chilling letter that he wrote while standing at the top of Yellowstone National Park. And I'd like to think that Austin unknowingly left all of us with some wise words at the end of that letter. Again, he wrote, "Life is beautiful, go out and live it." But not every Yellowstone mystery has such an inspiring message. Like one time when a man went deep into the woods in search of fallen elk horns, but instead he ended up becoming the centerpiece of a sheriff corruption investigation, one that sparked a massive lawsuit and spawned yet another one of the biggest mysteries in the history of the park. On April 6th, 1991, Daniel Lynn Campbell was dropped off by some friends at the Hell-Roaring Creek trailhead in Yellowstone National Park. He had brought along a light backpack and his loyal Australian shepherd. Now, Daniel had worked as a logger, and so he was no stranger to the woods, to the outdoors. He understood the weather, he understood the terrain, and he had a ton of confidence, which can both be a blessing and sometimes a curse for adventurers. The reason he was heading into the backcountry was to collect shed antlers to then sell for profit. And in case you don't know, I didn't know much about this before research for this video, shed hunting is the practice of going out to find antlers that are naturally shed by deer and elk in the winter and early spring. And since removing these antlers apparently disturbs the natural environment, shed hunting is an illegal activity in many wild places, and it's definitely illegal in a national park like Yellowstone. Daniel planned to spend 2 days collecting antlers and then meet up with his girlfriend right outside of the park in a small town in Montana. Aside from the legal problem, this was supposed to be a fairly simple trip into a wilderness that Daniel knew extremely well. And that's one of the things that I've learned from covering these stories over these last few years. You can know the wilderness your entire life, but it still only takes one bad moment to flip what was supposed to be a simple trip completely upside down. Daniel and his dog started down the trail that morning, but they had no idea the hellscape that they were walking into because just a few hours later, heavy spring snowstorms rolled across the Yellowstone high country. The mountains and steep canyons throughout the park suddenly vanished without warning beneath a layer of snow. Trails blurred, tracks disappeared, and Hell-Roaring Creek Trail was buried too. And so it's safe to say that if Daniel had known this kind of devastating storm was coming, he might have packed some different gear, he might not have brought his dog along, or he might not have even stepped foot on the trail in the first place. He was an experienced outdoorsman after all, but he was not prepared for weather like this. The snow continued to blanket the park, and after a few days passed, Daniel was supposed to finally meet up with his girlfriend. There was no doubt that Daniel and his dog would be cold and wet and truly exhausted by the time they reached the pickup spot, and so his girlfriend prepared to help in any way she could. But as she waited and waited, Daniel didn't appear. It was starting to become clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Daniel was nowhere to be found, and that's when he was reported missing on April 9th. 3 days after he and his dog wandered towards this unknown snowy hell. Search crews moved in to scan the snow-covered area from the air and on foot, and theories quickly started forming. Initially, authorities wondered if Daniel may have deliberately disappeared in order to escape some debts that he had recently accrued. Maybe he thought that he could outrun his financial troubles. However, his family soon came forward and disputed that theory very heavily. They didn't think that Daniel would simply vanish on purpose, and they also said that Daniel was just about to collect a significant legal settlement in a court case. I couldn't find any more information on this alleged settlement payout, but if Daniel's family was so sure that he didn't vanish on purpose, then well, that's enough for me to doubt this particular theory. And plus, if he was really trying to run away, why would he have told his girlfriend to meet up with him? And even if he really loved his dog, wouldn't bringing the dog along just make his escape even harder than it was already gonna be? I personally don't think Daniel disappeared on purpose, and that makes me wonder if maybe someone else was involved. And I'm not the only one that feels that way, by the way. Daniel's brother suspected foul play as well. They pointed towards reports from other hunters in the area that claimed to have heard some gunshots around the time that Daniel was missing. They also focused on an incident in nearby Park County, Montana, where police confiscated gear from another pair of local hunters who were illegally shed gathering. When those Park County hunters were searched, authorities found ammunition, some spent cartridges, possibly even a firearm, and this was highly suspicious since those horn hunters were already breaking the law, but the equipment was eventually returned and they were cleared of any further suspicion surrounding Daniel's disappearance. But Daniel's family didn't like how that case was handled whatsoever, and they eventually decided to take the authorities to court. They filed a federal lawsuit against former Park County Sheriff Charlie Johnson, alleging that he mishandled the investigation and failed to properly consider the possibility of murder or foul play when it came to Daniel's disappearance. According to the lawsuit, the brothers believed that Daniel could have been hurt during a dispute with other antler hunters, and when those Park County hunters were searched, the police had apparently failed to properly fingerprint or do any other customary forensic testing. The brothers argued that by failing to preserve and properly test that evidence, any potential homicide investigation was compromised pretty much from the start. They also wondered if even more evidence could have been lost or disposed of entirely. But the sheriff department insisted that this was a missing persons case and there was no proof that Daniel was murdered, or that he was even in Park County at all, where the ammunition and weapons had been found. But the brothers obviously saw things differently. They thought the police failed to do their jobs and that it caused them to lose precious time in the search for Daniel. But authorities searched all that they could. They looked for evidence of some kind of animal attack or some sign that Daniel had suffered from exposure, but throughout all of this, they kept coming up empty. They found no gear, no clothing, no remains, and sadly, they couldn't even find Daniel's sweet dog either. And to this day, over 3 decades later, Daniel has still never been found. And through all of the uncertainty of his disappearance, his family has never even held a memorial service. Instead, they've chosen to seek justice in court and hope that one day they'll get some kind of answer. And man, I really hope they do, because I can't even imagine. Crazy things wash up on the shores of lakes and rivers all the time. Sometimes it's just driftwood, sometimes it's trash. But in 2021, the shoreline of one of Yellowstone's most popular lakes became a living nightmare that park rangers would never forget. But before we get to all of that, let me tell you about a 74-year-old Utah man named Kim Crumbo and his stepbrother, Mark O'Neill. On September 15th, 2021, Kim and Mark went out into the wilderness together on a 4-night backcountry canoeing trip to Shoshone Lake, which is the second largest lake in Yellowstone. The two men were both pretty experienced outdoorsmen. Hell, Mark was even a former park ranger at Grand Canyon and Olympic National Parks, and so they were just looking forward to some classic quiet adventuring out on the water. This was the kind of trip that you and your buddies probably always talk about going on, but then the plans inevitably end up falling through year after year. The only difference here is that Kim and Mark were actually making this dream trip happen. The brothers were expected to return from their trip on Sunday, September 19th, but when that day came around, their family members hadn't seen or heard from them whatsoever. And at first, the family assumed that the pair had simply been a little bit delayed, which happens on backcountry trips like this. That's not unusual whatsoever. But as the hours stretched later and later into the evening, and their car remained parked at the trailhead, the complete silence became impossible to ignore. And so by the next morning, park officials were called and notified of the terrifying news that these two men were missing. Search teams were quickly mobilized and began focusing on the remote waters of Shoshone Lake and the surrounding wilderness as well. Rangers launched boats into the lake, they scanned the shorelines, and they checked every possible campsite that the brothers might have used during their trip. They also searched from the skies, using helicopters to scan the forest, while ground crews began working their way through miles of trail. Sonar equipment was even used, they're like probing the depths of the lake, looking for any sign of the missing men. Yellowstone Rangers were joined by teams from other national parks, even local agencies, partner search and rescue organizations. I'm saying all this because I want to illustrate that this search was like the definition of all hands on deck. Investigators considered several possibilities, including the theory that the brothers were in a canoeing accident. I mean, that sounds like the most logical thing when you don't know anything, right? Shoshone Lake is very large, it's cold, and it can turn rough without warning. Strong afternoon winds can create choppy water capable of capsizing even the most experienced paddlers. And, if you do capsize, then the freezing water could quickly drain a person's strength and coordination. It's also a possibility that the two men may have become separated at some point during the trip. I mean, if one of them had been injured or stranded somehow, the other one might have gone to try and find help, leaving both of them alone and way more vulnerable than before. The backcountry around Shoshone Lake can be extremely thick, making navigation difficult, especially if you were all by yourself in this hypothetical situation. A medical emergency is another possibility. I mean, you have to mention both men were older and could have suffered a heart attack or some serious health event, far away from help. And then, of course, anytime you're talking about Yellowstone, you have to wonder if maybe animals were involved. There's grizzly bears there, black bears, wolves, mountain lions, moose, a lot of large animals. And so these animals can be a threat, and you have to prepare accordingly. With that said, though, officials didn't find any tracks or blood or any clear signs that wildlife was involved. They explored all of these different theories, but without witnesses or any evidence, the search was running up against more and more dead ends. But then, a member of the search crew spotted something bizarre on the shoreline that would go on to change this case forever. It didn't look like driftwood or any type of rock that he'd ever seen, and so he pulled the boat right alongside of it to get a better look. The rest of the crew also took immediate interest, and as they got closer and closer to this mysterious object, they realized what it was. And you probably realize what it is too. They found a human body. Authorities immediately tried to identify this body, and since they had been working with so much identifying information about both brothers, like their clothing and facial features, stuff like that, they were quickly able to determine that they had found the body of Mark O'Neill. This gruesome discovery had finally answered one question about what happened, but it also raised a lot more questions, right? Like, what might have happened that caused Mark to end up in this exact spot? And also, where the hell was Kim? I mean, they had miraculously found one brother, but somehow the other brother was still missing, still nowhere to be found, and they were left with even more questions than they had before. At this point, all of the previous theories were still on the table. Maybe he too had drowned in the lake, or maybe gotten attacked by an animal, or had a health event of some kind. Whatever had happened, one thing was for sure, and that was that Kim had clearly been separated from his brother on the adventure, and that meant that even if crews were able to retrace Mark's path perfectly, it still wouldn't tell them the full story. The search continued, but by this point, helicopters had already flown countless hours over the region. Boats had crisscrossed the lake over and over again, and search teams had combed through miles of wilderness. Despite this relentless effort, the search still hadn't produced any new clues after 3 weeks of desperation. Park officials had officially hit their dead end, and they heartbreakingly announced that the active search for Kim would be scaled back. To this day, park officials have declined to release additional details about what may have occurred, and the mystery of what happened to the brothers remains unanswered. Guys, please go leave a comment right now showing some love to these brothers and the rest of the victims that we talked about in this story, as well as the searchers, the park rangers, everyone who worked so hard on these cases. It always warms my heart when I read comments from you guys, just being so respectful to the victims. And so thank you so much for watching, and YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy this video next, and so give it a click. And if you're ever in Yellowstone National Park, be sure to be safe out there.